So, to demonstrate how our lives are similar to a table, um, how different aspects of our lives are like the legs of a table, or maybe even the pillars that create a roofed structure. Doesn't need to be a flat tabletop. If there is an imbalance in the top surface, like of a slanted roof, that's okay. But the pillars and the roof do need to connect to each other in a certain way. There does need to be a, a proper alignment of the lengths of the pillars with the shape of the roof. So to demonstrate my answer about what are these four pillars or four legs metaphorically in our lives, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. And within the details that I'm about to share, and I'm actually going to be somewhat vague, but within the details that I'm about to share, there are lessons that are relevant and important in regard to the issue of a well-balanced, stable life. And naturally, part of the story I'm about to share is about a shift from imbalance toward balance, and from certain kinds of instability toward stability. So to begin, I grew up on the East Coast of the U.S., and then in my mid-20s, I made a long trip by myself to the West Coast. And after that, I returned east for a few years. Then, still by myself, I moved back west, where I've stayed for all but 1 year since then. And one of the most important details I mentioned so far, was that both times that I went west, I went by myself. I was removing myself from a particular social life on the East Coast, particular momentums in my life in general, and in particular, the social network, my connections on the East Coast. I was physically removing myself from that setting. So first I removed myself by traveling west for a trip of several months. And then a few years later, I relocated west, and I, really extracted myself, you might say, from that social context that was familiar to me. So I've traveled many other times by myself or with groups of friends, but when I went to the West Coast, and then when I moved to a southwestern state, not really on the coast, but in the west of the U.S., there was something different about those two big trips that I mentioned so far, and other times that I might have traveled by myself or with groups of friends. So when I traveled to the West Coast, well, that was a further trip. The distance was actually farther, and it was also a pretty long trip. And when I traveled to the West Coast that time, and then when I later moved to the West, I had a specific interest in removing myself from certain familiar social momentums. I wanted to stretch or drop or break certain social bonds, to remove myself from certain momentum, certain bonds. So I think that basic idea is pretty clear. So I was intentionally creating a destabilizing of my social life. Even just to move out to the West Coast by myself for a few months on a trip, it destabilized my social life at the time. And I was sacrificing social stability in order to pursue other targets. I was sacrificing social stability in order to pursue other targets, other interests. So when I first moved to the western U.S. to live, I had a few clear goals. And the most prominent of them was that I wanted to improve my health by pursuing a healthier lifestyle. And I'll give a little background on why and how that came to be a focus of mine. I had already become disappointed by the results I had experienced with mainstream medicine. Further, I had already begun to develop my interest in some new experimental methods, not just new to me, but literally pretty new, less than 100 years old, let's say, less than even 10 or 20 years old in some cases. So I developed an interest in some new experimental methods as well as some ancient practices that were very solidly established in terms of effectiveness, but weren't necessarily familiar to me at that point in my life. Or maybe they were vaguely familiar, but I wasn't really using them. So those ancient practices are pretty distinct because they were solidly established in terms of effectiveness. They were not experimental. They weren't new. Relative to things like experimental drugs and experimental surgeries that were so popular in mainstream medicine at that time and continue to be. And also relative to the new experimental approaches within holistic medicine and alternative medicine and so on, the ancient practices were well established. And I might not have been really focused on that detail at the time, but I want to make that point at this stage as something that, you know, it actually was a stretch for me. There was a discomfort in leaving behind familiar medical practices and familiar health orientations and really taking my time by myself to research some things of interest to me. Some things that kind of made sense to me, but I was a little timid about, or a lot timid about. Or I wasn't even getting great results from my first experiments, but I was still hopeful. So I was opening up to well-established ancient methods, as well as opening up to cutting-edge experimental interventions within holistic medicine, methods that were still that had recently been developed or maybe even were still being refined. And at the same time, I was also getting increasingly skeptical about the experimental inventions of mainstream medicine, the new experimental drugs and experimental surgeries and so on. And by experimental, maybe they had a few decades of history, but that's actually pretty small amount of history. So I was also getting more skeptical and better informed. Kind of the two went together. The more informed, the more results I personally experienced from mainstream medicine, the more skeptical I was. The more skeptical I was, the more informed I got. The more informed I got, the more skeptical I was, and so on. So there was a transition there. And my disappointment was a key thing. I was disappointed, and over time, I came to just directly admit that. Very simple. I was disappointed in the results I was getting, and I was open to better results. So one of the issues that, again, over time got increasingly significant to me was that all of these experimental interventions in mainstream medicine, whether they were a few months old or a few decades old, they often had a long list of unfavorable side effects and risks associated with many of these widely publicized methods. They were familiar, they were heavily promoted, TV advertisements and school textbooks and so forth, and everybody around me, school nurses, you go to the drugstore, there's a sign of remember to whatever it says, and there's all this promotion of a certain set of practices, certain models of thinking and acting, and I was open to something different. So I don't want to get into any more detail than that at all. Even as I talk further about some of these issues, I'm not really going to get into any detail, but I do want to present that background point. So to review so far, I was sacrificing the familiar social stability that I was familiar with when I lived in the East Coast. I was destabilizing my social life in order to focus more on health. And as you can hear as I spoke about it, also to focus on being self-directed and being responsible, self-care, that kind of thing. So I was focusing more on health, my interests, my responsibility, my results, so forth. But while I was sacrificing social stability to focus on health, I was not just sacrificing social stability. There was more that I was sacrificing. I soon discovered that I was also sacrificing some financial stability. When I moved west, not so much when I visited west the West Coast, but a few years later when I moved west, I knew there would be some significant transitional costs, from down payments and deposits and getting established, not having a job. When I first moved out there, I'd quit my job on the East Coast. Actually, I had two jobs. I quit one of them. Then a few months later, I quit the second one. And, within a week or two, I, as I recall, of actually moving. So I moved. That took, several days. I drove. And over the course of weeks and months, I, started to look for work and income in the West. So I knew there'd be some transitional costs, plus I knew that I didn't have any work lined up for when I arrived. However, I did have some savings, and at that point in my life, it was the most savings I had ever had. So I had some savings, plus I had an excellent credit record, again, at that time, with lots of available credit on my existing credit cards at that time. And I knew that there would be an element of financial strain in moving west. Even in experimenting with certain, health practices. Some of them were extremely inexpensive. Some of them weren't. So I knew there'd be some element of financial strain in moving west. I just did not know how big of a challenge I would eventually face, or even how often I would face financial challenges over the course of years. So here's how I relate to it now. I was very motivated to improve my health. Again, I talked earlier about my disappointment and the results I had been getting in regard to health. So I was very motivated to improve my health, and I was willing to invest, or you could say sacrifice, money into that goal of promoting health. Even if I had to borrow some of that money, I was able to borrow it. I was committed to health. So in some cases, I borrowed money to try things that I hoped would be very beneficial to me. And I was willing to invest money or, destabilize my finances a little or a lot. And I was also willing to destabilize my familiar social momentum, my familiar social life. Why? In order to remove distractions that could slow me down in my exploration of how to best promote my health.